In the final weeks of April 1945, as the German Reich lay in ruins and the air over Europe vibrated with the thunder of approaching liberation, a strange calm settled over the fields, forests, and broken cities where surrender had become the only remaining act of war. The armies that had once marched with unshakable confidence under the black and white banners of conquest now stumbled westward, not toward triumph but toward captivity. The Wehrmacht, hollowed out by years of attrition and betrayal from within, dissolved into fragments of exhausted men who no longer knew what they were fighting for. They crossed fields of churned mud and wreckage, their uniforms shredded, their medals dulled by dust, their eyes haunted by something deeper than fear, something close to disbelief. They had been told that the Americans were barbarians in uniforms, that capture meant humiliation, perhaps execution, that the Western Allies were only a softer mask for the vengeance of the Bolshevik tide rolling from the east. Yet when the surrender finally came, when rifles were laid down, when the white flags rose like ghosts above the shattered countryside, what awaited them was not the retribution they expected but a quiet, almost incomprehensible order. The convoys began almost immediately. Thousands of captured German soldiers, officers, engineers, medics, tank crews, clerks, were gathered into makeshift enclosures under the wide spring sky. The air smelled of diesel fuel and wet earth, of smoke still rising from burned-out villages. American military police, many barely older than the prisoners themselves, directed the movement of these defeated armies with brisk efficiency. There was no shouting, no wild brutality, no public humiliation. The prisoners were searched, processed, and marched to holding areas. For many, this first encounter with the Americans was a shock that cut deeper than any battlefield wound. They expected beatings, they received food. They expected mockery, they received instructions in calm, measured English. They expected to be treated as monsters, and instead were treated, unthinkably, as men. It was this quiet civility, this strange sense of procedural fairness, that disoriented them most. In a Europe torn apart by total war, where cruelty had become routine and moral lines had been erased, the idea that an enemy could behave with decency felt not only foreign but subversive. As the days passed, the scale of surrender became almost biblical in its magnitude. Entire divisions laid down their arms. Generals accustomed to commanding tens of thousands now found themselves standing in the same lines as privates, waiting for identification tags to be logged and for transport trucks to carry them westward. Some were taken to the sprawling Rheinweisenlager camps along the Rhine, vast, open-air enclosures that soon held hundreds of thousands under the watch of U.S. forces. But others, particularly officers and technical specialists, were marked for transfer across the Atlantic. They would become part of a vast and largely hidden chapter of the war, the network of prisoner-of-war camps across the United States. From the moment those ships left the European ports, the prisoners entered a world they could not have imagined, a world that would test not their military discipline but their understanding of civilization itself. For many of them, captivity in America would become an education not in defeat, but in the paradoxical strength of mercy. When the ships carrying German POWs crossed the Atlantic under guarded silence, the men aboard them stood at the rails, staring at the endless gray water and wondering what awaited them on the other side. Some whispered prayers, others clung to rumors. They had heard stories, half believed, half denied, of camps in the American South, of cotton fields and strange, distant towns where the people spoke slowly and smiled easily. They expected interrogation, perhaps labor, perhaps punishment. What they did not expect was comfort. When the ships finally reached ports like New York, Boston, and Norfolk, the prisoners were astonished to see civilians gathered at the docks, not jeering crowds, but curious faces, ordinary Americans looking on as their government processed the remnants of an enemy army with clinical precision. The men were marched into trains, their boots echoing on wooden platforms, and taken inland, deeper and deeper into the heart of a nation that had fought them from oceans away but now offered them something their own homeland could not: order without cruelty, power without hatred. In places like Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Camp Swift in Texas, and Camp Algona in Iowa, the scene repeated itself with the strange regularity of history's quiet moments. Rows of clean barracks stood beneath the open sky. Showers, kitchens, infirmaries, all waiting for men who had expected cages and chains. The first reaction among the captured officers was suspicion. This must be deception, they thought, a mask of politeness to conceal a harsher reality. Yet as the days turned into weeks, the mask did not fall. American guards greeted them with military formality but without contempt. The food was plentiful by wartime standards: fresh bread, meat, even coffee. Medical officers treated their wounds with diligence. Chaplains offered services to those who wished to pray. Some of the younger GIs, unshaven and sunburned, looked at the prisoners with curiosity rather than hatred. To them, these Germans were no longer mythical villains but tired, ordinary men in faded uniforms. It was a reversal so profound that it unsettled both sides. For the Americans, it was an opportunity to demonstrate the values they had been told they were fighting for. For the Germans, it was a confrontation with everything they had been told to despise. The camp routines followed a rhythm that, while regimented, carried none of the arbitrary terror they had known under their own regime. Roll calls, work details, mealtimes, recreation, each moment governed by order but not fear. Within weeks, the prisoners began to recover a strange sense of dignity. Letters from home were rare, and the news that filtered through the guards spoke of Germany's devastation: the cities flattened, the Führer dead, the Reich dissolved. For many officers, this realization brought an existential collapse. Everything they had believed in, every oath they had sworn, every act they had justified in the name of a thousand-year empire, now lay buried beneath rubble. And yet, in this foreign captivity, they encountered a new kind of authority, one that did not demand ideological loyalty or blind obedience but expected honesty, discipline, and respect. For the first time in years, perhaps in their lives, they experienced a military system that derived strength not from fear, but from restraint. Among the most striking impressions recorded by these men in their diaries and letters, some later published, others preserved in archives, was the quiet professionalism of their American captors. At Fort Hunt in Virginia, a secret interrogation center known only by its code name, P.O. Box 1142, U.S. intelligence officers conducted debriefings that blended psychological insight with moral subtlety. Instead of torture or humiliation, they used conversation, empathy, and intellectual challenge to draw information from high-ranking prisoners. Generals, scientists, and U-boat commanders who had braced themselves for brutality instead found themselves facing interrogators who offered them cigarettes, coffee, and respect. This was no sentimental kindness, it was strategy. The Americans understood that dignity could be disarming. By treating their prisoners as rational men, they exposed the contradictions of a regime that had denied humanity to others. Many of the Germans, trained to equate mercy with weakness, found themselves confounded by the strength that emanated from self-control. In the broader network of camps scattered across America's heartland, life developed its own strange normalcy. Prisoners planted gardens, built furniture, played soccer, and performed music. They were paid in scrip for their labor, used to buy cigarettes or soap at camp canteens. In some places, they even worked alongside local farmers, harvesting crops or repairing fences. The locals, at first wary, gradually grew accustomed to their presence. Stories spread of German prisoners who sang in church choirs, who exchanged Christmas greetings with American families, who sent home descriptions of America that sounded almost utopian compared to the wasteland of post-war Europe. The paradox deepened: in captivity, they found freedom of a kind they had not known under the Nazi flag. There was no Gestapo, no ideological commissar, no speeches demanding loyalty. Only rules. Even for those who remained unrepentant, the contrast was impossible to ignore. In letters and conversations, many prisoners spoke of the Americans' moral cleanliness, a phrase that captured both admiration and unease. The United States, with its segregated South and its own imperfections, was no paradise of equality, but compared to the moral corrosion of Nazi Europe, it represented a kind of ethical order that the prisoners could neither dismiss nor fully comprehend. The young GIs who guarded them, many of them farmers' sons or college students who had never seen combat, embodied a simplicity of belief that disarmed cynicism. They did not hate. They enforced rules because they believed in them, not because they were afraid of punishment. To German officers steeped in a culture of hierarchy and brutality, this attitude was both alien and haunting. Some began to reflect, quietly, reluctantly, on what had gone wrong in their own country. Others clung stubbornly to pride, refusing to see their captors as anything more than fortunate victors. But time, and the steady persistence of decency, had its own corrosive power. The seasons changed, and with them, the meaning of captivity. In the heat of American summers, the camps buzzed with the rhythms of work and adaptation. Prisoners studied English, read American newspapers, and debated among themselves what the future might hold. Some believed they would never return home, others saw in their captors' fairness a faint hope for reconstruction, for a Germany that might one day mirror the balance of power and humanity they now observed around them. When winter came, the barracks were warm, the rations steady. The guards rotated in and out, many bound for redeployment or discharge. The war had ended, but for the men behind the fences, it lingered as a memory, a wound, and a lesson. They watched America from the inside, its vastness, its contradictions, its easy confidence, and realized that they were witnessing not just the triumph of a military power but the manifestation of a cultural idea, that decency, consistently applied, could be stronger than fear. By the time the first repatriations began in late 1945 and 1946, many of these men carried with them an impression that would alter their lives and, in some cases, the direction of post-war Germany itself. They returned home not to the Reich they had served, but to a nation shattered and occupied, its cities in ashes and its people stripped of illusion. Yet the memory of what they had seen in American camps persisted. In letters and memoirs, they spoke of it as an awakening, a moral confrontation that no ideology could suppress. They had been defeated militarily, but in defeat they had glimpsed a strength that came not from domination but from principle. For some, this realization inspired quiet transformation, for others, it remained a source of confusion and envy. But collectively, it planted a seed, a fragile, enduring idea that perhaps civilization was not measured by conquest, but by the ability to treat even one's enemies with humanity. This, then, was the paradox of victory in 1945. The United States had fought a brutal, total war against an enemy that had sought to enslave the world, yet when the guns fell silent, it wielded its greatest weapon not in vengeance but in restraint. In its POW camps, scattered from the Mississippi fields to the forests of Wisconsin, America built not just fences but mirrors, reflective surfaces in which the defeated could see themselves, not as masters or monsters, but as men confronted by the consequences of their own choices. To those who lived through it, captivity in America became a crucible of moral reckoning. It was there, amid the hum of cicadas and the distant sound of trains, that they learned the final lesson of the war, that strength without compassion destroys itself, and that the true victory of a civilization lies not in how it conquers its enemies, but in how it treats them once the conquest is complete. As months of captivity unfolded into a rhythm of monotony and reflection, the reality of defeat began to settle not just on the bodies but on the souls of the captured Wehrmacht officers. In the quiet corridors of American camps and in the sealed rooms of Fort Hunt's secret compound, a new kind of battle was being waged, a war of conscience, perception, and ideology. The rifles had been laid down, but the invisible structures of belief that had sustained an empire of destruction did not collapse overnight. They lingered inside these men like an infection that had not yet run its course. What the Americans understood, though they seldom spoke of it, was that to win the peace, they would have to win the minds of those who had served the Reich. And to do that, they would not rely on propaganda or coercion, but on something infinitely more subversive, the steady, patient demonstration of decency. At Fort Hunt, located on the wooded banks of the Potomac River in Virginia, the interrogation of German prisoners took on a form unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. Officially, the facility did not exist, it was known only by its postal designation, P.O. Box 1142. Behind its fences and nondescript barracks, intelligence officers fluent in German, trained in psychology and diplomacy, met with some of the most formidable minds of the defeated enemy. Among the prisoners were scientists from the V-2 rocket program, naval officers who had commanded U-boats across the Atlantic, and generals who had planned campaigns from the Ardennes to the Eastern Front. These were not ordinary soldiers, they were the architects of a machine that had once terrified the world. Yet within the walls of Fort Hunt, their authority evaporated. They were men stripped of uniforms, rank, and certainty, confronted by interrogators who treated them not as beasts to be broken but as intellects to be understood. The method employed there was simple and devastating in its subtlety. There were no whips, no blinding lights, no shouted accusations. Instead, there were conversations, long, measured, courteous exchanges conducted over coffee, often punctuated by silence. The Americans would ask about technical details, about troop movements, about communication codes, but behind every question lay a deeper purpose: to observe, to listen, to humanize. The interrogators learned that by offering their captives dignity, they disarmed them far more effectively than by force. A man who is treated as a human being, even in defeat, becomes vulnerable to empathy, and empathy, in turn, begins to erode the barriers of ideology. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, these men, who had once dismissed their enemies as decadent and inferior, found themselves speaking openly, even respectfully, with those they had been taught to despise. Some prisoners later confessed that what disturbed them most was not the loss of power but the realization that their captors did not need cruelty to assert dominance. The Americans operated from a moral confidence that was both alien and alluring. They did not shout slogans or demand confession, they simply behaved as though decency were a natural condition of strength. For many Germans, this was their first encounter with an authority untainted by fear. In Nazi Germany, authority had always been theatrical, loud, violent, omnipresent. Here, it was quiet, procedural, and yet unyielding. The rules were absolute, but they were fair. Punishment existed, but it was predictable, never capricious. To a people conditioned to equate order with terror, this balance was incomprehensible at first. Yet as the weeks at Fort Hunt turned into months, even the most hardened officers began to sense the outlines of another civilization, one that measured power not by domination, but by self-control. Beyond the walls of Fort Hunt, in the hundreds of camps scattered across the American interior, similar transformations were taking place on a broader, more human scale. The younger prisoners, less burdened by ideology, adapted most quickly. They learned English from their guards, exchanged jokes, and sometimes helped on nearby farms. The Americans, many of whom had grown up during the Great Depression, understood hardship but not hatred. They looked upon their captives with a kind of practical tolerance, seeing in them not monsters but men who had made terrible choices under terrible systems. For some guards, this compassion was instinctive; for others, it was a conscious act of defiance against the brutality they had seen in Europe. In either case, the result was the same, a quiet cultural exchange that defied the logic of war. As newspapers in America printed stories of victory and reconstruction, few civilians realized that inside these fenced compounds, a different victory was unfolding, a moral one. German officers began organizing lectures and discussions, not about military tactics, but about philosophy, literature, and ethics. Some studied the U.S. Constitution, astonished that a nation could enshrine freedom of speech even for its critics. Others read translations of American writers, Emerson, Whitman, Twain, and found in their words a spirit of individualism that stood in stark contrast to the uniformity they had been raised to worship. The camp libraries, modest at first, became laboratories of rediscovery. In those quiet hours between roll calls, under the hum of electric lights, men who had once marched through conquered capitals now wrestled with questions they had never been allowed to ask. What does it mean to obey? What does it mean to be free? There were, of course, those who resisted this awakening. Among the older officers, the ones steeped in the iron codes of Prussian discipline, surrender was not merely a military failure but a moral collapse. They viewed their captors' kindness as a trick, an insult to their honor. Some refused to eat the food, believing it poisoned by hypocrisy; others isolated themselves, clinging to the belief that the American civility masked a deeper contempt. Yet even these holdouts could not entirely escape the dissonance that surrounded them. Each day that passed without humiliation, each gesture of respect from a young American guard, gnawed at the certainties they had built their lives upon. The ideology that had promised invincibility had delivered only ruin. The enemy they had been taught to scorn as weak now held them, not with chains, but with a moral gravity they could neither comprehend nor dismiss. Back at Fort Hunt, intelligence officers compiled detailed psychological profiles of the prisoners, noting their reactions, their values, their vulnerabilities. What emerged from these reports was a portrait of a defeated generation at war with itself. Some prisoners clung to the idea that the Führer had been betrayed, that Germany's loss was the result of treachery rather than delusion. Others began to recognize that the real betrayal had been moral, the surrender of conscience to ideology. The Americans, by refraining from cruelty, allowed this realization to surface naturally. They knew that forced repentance was meaningless, only voluntary introspection could produce genuine change. Thus, the interrogations at Fort Hunt became, in a sense, confessions without judgment. The Germans spoke, the Americans listened, and through that exchange, fragments of truth emerged, about the structure of the Nazi regime, about its scientific ambitions, about its inner decay. Yet beneath the intelligence gathered for strategic purposes lay something deeper, the slow rehumanization of the enemy. In the broader camps, this transformation took on a communal form. The daily work assignments, cutting timber, repairing roads, tending crops, became, for many prisoners, acts of restoration rather than punishment. Labor had been weaponized under the Reich, turned into a mechanism of domination. Here, it was different. The work was purposeful but not degrading, it contributed to something tangible, something that served life rather than destruction. Local farmers who supervised POW work details were often surprised by the discipline and skill of the Germans. In turn, the prisoners were surprised by the farmers' straightforwardness, their lack of malice. Slowly, suspicion gave way to mutual respect. There were moments, small, almost invisible, when the boundaries between captor and captive blurred, a shared cigarette after a long day's harvest, a brief conversation about family, a silent nod of acknowledgement that transcended language. These moments, though fleeting, became the moral punctuation marks of the war's aftermath. As months turned to years, the American experiment in humane captivity began to yield unexpected results. When the prisoners were eventually repatriated, many carried back to Germany not just memories of decent treatment, but seeds of transformation. Some of the men who had once commanded battalions returned home to become teachers, engineers, and civic leaders in the new democratic Germany. They spoke quietly of what they had seen in America, of justice without hatred, of discipline without cruelty. For them, the experience of being treated as human beings in defeat redefined what civilization could mean. Historians would later call it re-education, but to those who lived it, it felt less like instruction and more like revelation. They had glimpsed the possibility that strength could coexist with compassion, and that realization would ripple through the reconstruction of post-war Europe. Even within the secret corridors of Fort Hunt, where intelligence rather than ideology was the mission, the human dimension of this experiment did not go unnoticed. American officers who had spent months interviewing German scientists and strategists came away changed as well. They discovered that the enemy was not a monolith of evil but a spectrum of humanity, some complicit, some coerced, all entangled in a system that had rewarded obedience and punished thought. This recognition did not excuse their crimes, but it reframed the concept of victory. To defeat an enemy was easy, to understand him, and to ensure he never rose again in the same form, required empathy tempered by vigilance. The men of P.O. Box 1142 had achieved something extraordinary without realizing it. They had transformed interrogation into dialogue, and captivity into a moral classroom. Outside the wire, America itself was changing. The war had brought prosperity and pride, but also introspection. Stories of how German prisoners were being treated filtered through the newspapers and local communities. Some citizens questioned the generosity, arguing that the enemy did not deserve such comfort. Others defended it as a testament to American values, a living proof that democracy could remain humane even in victory. The debate, though often practical in tone, reflected a deeper truth. that how a nation treats its enemies reveals the boundaries of its own soul. By choosing restraint over revenge, America affirmed something essential about its identity, even as it struggled with its own imperfections at home. For the prisoners, these contradictions were visible and instructive. They saw segregation in the South, labor strikes in the North, political disagreements broadcast openly in newspapers, all signs of a society not perfect, but free. In that freedom lay a kind of strength that no totalitarian system could replicate. Some prisoners began to write essays and journals about their experiences, comparing American democracy with the authoritarian rigidity of the regime they had served. These writings, modest and personal, would later form part of a quiet intellectual current that flowed into the rebuilding of West Germany. The camps had become, unintentionally, schools of democracy, not through lectures or indoctrination, but through lived experience. As the years of captivity drew to a close and the first ships began carrying the men back to Europe, the mood in the camps was complex. Relief mingled with nostalgia. They longed for home, yet feared what they would find there. Germany was a landscape of ruins, its cities gutted, its people starving, its moral compass shattered. America, for all its fences and guards, had become a strange kind of sanctuary, a place where they had rediscovered fragments of decency they thought lost to history. When they boarded the trains and ships that would return them across the Atlantic, many did so with quiet tears, not for the Reich that had fallen, but for the unexpected humanity they were leaving behind. In the years that followed, as Europe rebuilt and the world entered the tense calm of the Cold War, the legacy of these POW camps faded from public memory. Yet the invisible influence remained. In classrooms, parliaments, and city councils across the new West Germany, men who had once been prisoners in America invoked lessons learned behind barbed wire, that justice must be tempered by mercy, that strength is meaningless without conscience, that civilization depends on how we treat those who have lost everything. These were not slogans taught in classrooms, they were lived truths, forged in the quiet spaces between war and peace, between guilt and redemption. And so, in retrospect, the American POW camps of 1945 to 1946 were not merely holding pens for defeated soldiers. They were laboratories of moral reconstruction. Within their wooden barracks and dusty yards, amid the routines of work and the echoes of distant memories, two civilizations had faced each other, not as conqueror and conquered, but as reflections of what humanity could be at its best and worst. The Americans, by choosing to uphold dignity even for their enemies, demonstrated that kindness, when anchored in justice, could become a weapon more enduring than fear. The Germans, in learning to receive that kindness, began, however slowly, however painfully, the process of reclaiming their own humanity. By the time the last camp gates closed and the final prisoners departed, the war that had once engulfed the world had been transformed into memory. Yet within that memory lay the quiet triumph of moral strength, a triumph not recorded in medals or monuments, but in the unspoken gratitude of men who had discovered, in the heart of their defeat, the true meaning of civilization.